So what I was mentioning before, you remember the amygdala, that's the fear and anxiety centre of the brain, and the studies suggest that over the long term of practicing mindfulness, not only do people feel less depressed, but actually the amygdala, the fear and anxiety centre, starts to quieten down, which is very helpful. A person experiences it as, over time, feeling more settled for more of the time, but what's going on in the brain is actually reflecting that. They've got all sorts of fancy brain scans and things they can do these days, which really, in a lot of ways, validate what people have noted in their own experience. Mindfulness and craving. This is just an example looking at people who are trying to give up something like smoking. If we smoke, we're more likely to get depression and other mental health problems. And if we're depressed and got mental health problems, we're more likely to smoke. So it's a vicious cycle we can get into. So people trying to give up smoking and dealing with the craving, the impulse to smoke, is not necessarily very easy. Most people deal with it by suppressing the craving, trying to keep a lid on it. And that comes at an emotional cost. So many people will have their mental health get significantly worse just at the time when they're trying to give up something like that, because the harder they try, the more stress it actually causes. When people were taught mindfulness, they were able to notice the impulses to smoke, but to learn to be more relaxed and just, in a sense, not so attached to those impulses, so to let them flow in and flow out without getting so drawn into them. So that people were actually able to give up to smoking the same as the people who were putting a lid on it, but it didn't come at an emotional cost or a mental health cost in terms of mood. We teach our medical students about all of this at Monash University, and it's interesting, all our students have a program in mindfulness that so they'll learn how to apply it in their own lives. Certainly so that it can benefit their own mental and emotional health, but secondly so that it can, they know more about it one day for when they've got people coming into their consulting room and they've got something more than the script pad to go for in terms of providing strategies for dealing with mental health issues. So it's interesting to note that our students, not only did 90% of them by the end of the program report applying it in their own life, but we're also interested to find everything we measured about their mental health and well-being had significantly improved by the end of the program, even in high-stress periods like exam times. Mindfulness and doctor well-being. So doctors trained in mindfulness, they notice they become more mindful, thank heavens for that. They get less burnout. They experience more empathy, and I suppose it makes sense if we're more attentive to who and certainly is in front of us, then I suppose it's a no-brainer really that one would start to experience more empathy. We'll put it the other way, if we're not really paying attention to who or what's in front of us, then we don't experience much empathy. But also they're much more emotionally stable and at the same time conscientious, not in an obsessive way, but conscientious in a focused and motivated way. So, as you can see, this guy is trying to practice a bit of mindfulness here, and he's got a lot of rewiring of his brain to do, and it's obviously going to take a bit of time. So, it takes time to practice, but we notice, and these are just, I'm just showing them for the pictures, but it changes the way the brain works. And the areas of the brain associated with regulating emotions, with mood, with functioning, are all getting more blood, with the stress response settling down. So it's really changing what goes on in the brain. It's thickening up the grey matter, producing new brain cells in the brain. We didn't think the brain could do that. We now know it does have the capacity to do that, and mindfulness actually stimulates new brain cell growth. And the compassion centres in the brain become more responsive. So when you actually measure it, a person says they feel more compassion, well, that's reflected on what goes on in the brain as well. Emotional intelligence, I won't go into it too much, but these are the hallmarks of emotional intelligence, and people who rate highly on mindfulness rate highly on emotional intelligence as well. That is, the more mindful we become, the more emotional intelligence comes with it as well. And I suppose it stands to reason as well, more self-awareness, more self-regulation, for example. So without much emotional intelligence, anger arises and there's just an angry outburst and there's no awareness around it at all. When we're more aware, if the anger arises, there's more choice about whether or not to express it, rather than just being controlled by it. So rather than trying to control the emotion, learning not to be controlled by the emotion. That is, being able to notice it, to feel it, to acknowledge its presence, but not to have to necessarily be dominated or controlled by it. That is not necessarily easy with a very strong emotion. So it's a capacity that takes time and cultivation. It's not an easy skill to learn. And just the last bit before we move on to all the other elements in the essence model is just to talk about genetics. And Australia's Nobel Prize winner Elizabeth Blackburn, you know, there was an Australian woman who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for medicine, and she discovered how our genes age. And she's been doing some research on mindfulness meditation and actually finding that it improves genetic repair and slows genetic aging. So it's very early days in terms of that research, but it's certainly very interesting. And when Nobel Prize winners are starting to do research on mindfulness meditation, you know there's going to be some high quality science coming out. So, so this is Elizabeth Blackburn and her group doing this research on mindfulness meditation.